All right, welcome folks to FCYO's webinar on the Moment to Movement Fund. I'm going to give folks 1 or 2 minutes to arrive and we'll get started in just a moment or two. In the meantime, while people are arriving, we can use the chat feature to do some quick introductions. So if you want to just look at the chat feature and tell us your name, your organization, where you're at in geography, and tell us one thing that is bringing you inspiration these days for your work. We all can use a little more of that. So again, while we're waiting for folks to arrive, if you want to use the chat, just set the chat so that you're chatting to everyone, all panelists and attendees. That way everybody can see it. And tell us your name, your organization, where you're at, and one thing that's bringing you inspiration for your work these days. And we will get started in just a minute. Again, thanks for everybody for joining us. All right, I see some of the introductions starting to come on in the chat. Again, for those who just jumped on, as we're getting started, tell us your name, your organization, where you're at, and one thing that is bringing you inspiration for your work. We always love to know who all is on these webinars and joining us. All right, and with that, I think we will go ahead and get ready to begin. So let me just start out by saying a little bit about this webinar. So welcome, this is the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing's webinar on our Moment to Movement Fund. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a basic overview of the RFP, answer any questions that you may have about the Moment to Movement Fund so that you can fill out the application. And we'll have a bunch of time for Q&A as we go along. The chat feature is open, so feel free to use the chat feature to interact with each other. I have my colleagues Hashim Benford and Jennifer Maldonado, JMO from FCYO. They will be on the chat feature. If you have questions, please put your questions using the Q&A bar. If you look down at the bottom of your screen below the slides that you're looking at, there's a little thing that says Q&A. So if you have questions for us, instead of putting them in the chat where we might lose them, please put your questions in the Q&A tab. And that will be the best way for us to be able to respond to you. So with that, I'll go ahead and begin. And if you have questions or problems or anything with the tech or anything like that, JMO is on, and you can send her messages in the chat as well, and she'll help solve all of those issues. So with that, let's start doing a little bit of an overview about the Moment to Movement Fund, and a little bit about FCYO first. So some of you may be familiar with the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing, but we are a collective of funders and youth organizers that are committed to ensuring that young people have the resources, the capacities, and the infrastructure to be a leading force for social change across the country. And we do this by a combination of different activities. We do some re-granting and capacity building. We're not an endowed foundation ourselves, but we raise money from other funders, and we distribute as much of it as we can to grassroots youth organizing groups, and we often run capacity building initiatives as well. We try to build field infrastructure that brings youth organizing groups together from across the country to learn from each other, to share tools and resources, and to build collective strategies for building power. Third, we do a lot of organizing of funders. We know that it requires resources to do this work, and we try to bring funders together to help them understand the importance of this work and to build a larger base of funders who are committed to supporting youth organizing. And then last, we do a lot of research and communications. We try to build a knowledge base to help folks understand the power of youth organizing in philanthropy and in other places. So that's a little bit about what we do at FCYO. And I should note that we're excited that 2020 marks FCYO's 20th anniversary. So we're excited to be celebrating our 20th birthday and really to use that as an opportunity to look at how the field of youth organizing has grown over the last 20 years and the powerful work that you all have been doing and where are we going in the years to come. So a little bit about the Moment to Movement Fund. This is our second time that we've done a Moment to Movement Fund, and the basic purpose is to get resources to youth organizing groups that are responding to the current moment in ways that build long-term power. So these are one-year grants. We know that the best way to fund organizations is, long-term multi-general operating support, and we prefer to do that when we can. But so in this case, with some limited resources, we really think of these grants as a boost to what you're doing, right? We hope it'll be a small boost to support some of the important work that you're already doing. So our focus is on supporting groups that are organizing young people of color, gender oppressed young people, and working class young people around social, racial, and economic justice. We think that this is a really important moment that we're in right now. And so the Moment to Movement Fund has a particular interest in how are you responding to this current moment in a way that will build long-term power for your community. Now, at FCYO, usually our initiatives don't have a specific issue focus, but given the limited pool of resources that we have in this moment and some of the urgent issues of the time, we decided to focus this specific fund on two things. And that is climate change and voter engagement. We'll say a little bit more about what we're interested in those areas in a couple of minutes. But so overall, our intention is to make about 17 grants of $20,000 each. We don't know for sure how many folks will apply. I would expect that we'd get over 100 applicants, maybe more, and the intention is that we'll be able to make about 17 grants. Again, I'm going to keep going. I know some folks have joined since we started. If you just joined, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us your name and your organization, where you're at, and one thing that is inspiring you in your work these days. And if you have questions, again, we're going to really address questions at the end, but if you have them, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. Click that and go ahead and put the questions in there, and we'll go through a bunch of things and maybe answer some of your questions that way, and those that we don't, we'll get to. But instead of putting them in the chat or raising hand, put those questions in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to you that way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Hashim Benford to tell you a little bit more about FCYO's general strategy and orientation towards organizing. So
Great, thanks, Eric. Thank you, everybody, for getting on this webinar and for your interest in the Moment to Movement Fund. So what I'm going to outline is just to give people some context of how the Moment to Movement Fund fits in within the broader approach, orientation, and strategy of FCYO. So to start off, to review what's here in this slide, so the first kind of our starting point at FCYO is the recognition that we are living through a really critical period. So when we talk about the moment, yes, that means 2020 itself. Obviously, this is probably one of the most consequential political years in a generation or more. And that is couched within kind of a broader moment that really begins in 2008 with the financial crash and recession, where we are seeing all of these openings and opportunities as well as grave threats. So on the one hand, we've seen a resurgence in the Black liberation struggle in the form of the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black Lives. We've seen kind of a growing understanding of the kind of structural problem with capitalism that has been articulated through the Occupy movements and kind of a renewed interest in ideas like socialism. We have seen movements led by the Dreamers to challenge xenophobia. So all of these exciting mass movement opportunities that have emerged over the course of the last 8 or 10 years or so. At the same time, we're seeing grave threats personified in the form of the current administration that occupies the White House, the rise and increasing concentration of power in the hands of people like the Koch brothers and the wealthiest among us. So we are kind of coming from this understanding that we're in this really critical period where a lot of the common sense is broken down. There's a lot of politically disaffected people, and there's a fight over what is going to be the future of this country. And so there's huge opportunities for progressives and leftists to make significant advances. And the result of the struggles that we are engaged in today are going to reverberate for a long time to come, potentially generations down the road, whether we win or lose. So there's something that's really important about understanding that, like, the stuff that we're engaged in right now, I think as organizers, we always understand that there's urgency, but this is like really, really urgent. The second piece is that we understand that young people have a critical role to play in building the kind of movements that are going to determine whether or not we win or lose in these moments. So young people are the ones that are able and willing to take the most dynamic kinds of risks. They can, get up and move at a moment's notice. They're willing to put their bodies on the line. And young people have a really important long-term leadership role to play. So the way that we activate and develop young people in fights today determines their ability to be long-time movement leaders and for our ability to reproduce the social movements that are going to be necessary to transform society. And the third kind of piece underlying our strategies is recognition that in order for us to facilitate the transformative potential of young people, the youth organizing infrastructure in the US really needs to level up, and we need to find ways to build a new kind of power. Next slide, Eric. So to be clear on what we mean by power, and this relates to the Moment to Movement Fund, because one of the criteria when we're looking at these applications is we're going to be looking for groups that are both addressing the critical issues of today, particularly climate change and thinking about voter engagement, but we're really looking for groups that are doing that in a way that's connected to a long-term strategy for power. So here you see kind of our working definition. We define power as control over the conditions that affect our communities and society, and the ability to make or influence key decisions. So it really boils down to our ability to actually influence the conditions on the ground. So it's not just about policy wins, but that's an important piece, because we all know that policy wins without the power to actually ensure that they're implemented with fidelity can be kind of hollow. And so when we're talking about power, we're talking about the ability to influence decision-making, which often means we need to have a strategy for being both inside and outside those official structures of decision-making. Next slide. So our understanding of how we get there, how we build the power we need, is kind of broken down into these three main areas, and this is largely drawn on the work of the Grassroots Policy Project for people that are familiar with them and the three faces of power. So on one hand is this question of base building and getting to scale. And scale is about much more than just how many people you can mobilize in a moment. It's about how many people can we activate on a consistent basis around a common program and a common vision. And so we as youth organizers in the youth organizing field need to be thinking about how are we building bases beyond just dozens and hundreds, but how are we able to engage, activate, mobilize, and develop people in the thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions. Connected to that, in order for us to win the transformative change that we need, we know that we're not going to get there just by organizing our people. but we need to organize our people and our constituencies in relationship and as a part of long-term strategic alliances with other constituencies that we have a shared interest with, which means we may not agree on everything. We might have some tensions and contradictions that we have to resolve, but ultimately we need to be building our organizations and approaching strategy from a way that is building a broader progressive infrastructure. And then the third piece is that our fights need to be engaging in the war of ideas, that we need to be challenging the common sense. The notion of common sense is itself contested terrain. And I think, this is in my opinion, one of the areas where our movements are actually sometimes the strongest, because we're putting out narratives that counter white supremacy, that counter the assumptions of cis hetero patriarchy, counter the assumptions of capitalism. But that needs to be imbued in everything that we do. And this is how we build power over the long term, by building our bases, connecting those to a broader progressive infrastructure, and doing so in a way that is challenging norms and common sense, and actually creating opportunities for people to think about a new worldview. So that's a little bit about kind of what is grounding us as FCYO, and provide some context to, I think, better understand the momentum movement and what we mean by a long-term strategy connected to power. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Eric.
Sorry, I had a little trouble unmuting myself there. Technology is great when it works. Thank you, Hashim. So again, I think the reason that we wanted to share all that, in the RFP, we wrote a number of things that explain a little bit about our orientation towards power, and ask some questions about how you will build power through the proposal that you're developing. And so we wanted to just share a little bit of our definitions and our understanding of power building to provide some context for that. So hope that was helpful for everybody. All right, so now I want to say a little bit about some of the priority issues that we will be focusing on. So, we mentioned earlier that we have 2 areas of focus this year that are climate justice and voter engagement. So first, we'll say a little bit about climate justice. So I think folks know this. We know that right now climate change is representing an existential threat to life as we know it, but that also it creates the possibility to forge new alliances for a more just, sustainable, and equitable world. We also know that communities of color face the harshest impact of climate change and other environmental damage. And over this last year or two, we've really seen this growing youth climate movement in the US and around the world. But what we know at FCYO is that youth climate movement cannot be successful without the leadership of young people of color. Young people of color have been the driving force of movements in this country and around the world. So our focus around climate justice is going to be to support groups that are led by young people of color, that are advancing climate justice in the ways that your communities define it, right? We know that sometimes the way that there can be a mainstream way of looking at climate change, and we want to hear from you. How do you define climate justice, and what does that mean to you, right? So we're going to be interested in supporting groups led by young people of color who are advancing climate justice in their communities, and also supporting the leadership of young people of color in the broader climate movement. So our second focus is on nonpartisan voter engagement. We know that the 2020 election is a really important opportunity to ensure that working class young people of color, and gender oppressed young people have a voice in the future of this country. And we also know that a lot of your organizations are using voter engagement as part of a strategy to build power for your communities by connecting voter organizing, base building, leadership development, issue organizing. That's one strategy for building power. And so we see this moment that this election, that organizing around this election has to be part of making our movement stronger in 2020 and beyond. So we're interested in supporting organizing groups that are using various forms of nonpartisan electoral tactics to increase the participation of their communities in the 2020 elections, but are also part of a broader strategy for building community power. And as a note, right, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, so all of our funds are 501c3 funds, so any voter engagement has to be completely nonpartisan. So I'll say a little bit more about the requirements for this grant. One, we want to make sure that we engage young people who are involved in organizing. So leadership development, healing, giving young people a voice, providing services to young people, those things are all important. They may be part of your work, right? We know that organizing can include a lot of those components, but we'll really be looking for evidence of young people who are organizing campaigns, that young people are engaging in collective action around systemic change, that they're building a base in their communities to create broader systemic change. We're going to really, this opportunity is focused on groups that are engaging in organizing, collective action of young people around systemic change, particularly with low-income young people of color, gender-oppressed young people, and focus on ages 13 to 25. It's also really important to us that young people are involved in the leadership of those organizations. And because we're a 501c3, we can only make grants to 501c3 entities. So you need to either have a 501c3 or have a fiscal agent. If there's a particular problem around that, you can contact us and we can be in touch around it. We are able to give through fiscal agents, but we will need either a C3 or a fiscal agent to be able to make a grant. So a little bit about our preferences for what we're looking to fund through this grant. We're going to be looking for groups that can clearly articulate an organizing campaign that's related to one of our 2020 priorities of either climate justice or voter engagement. So we are focused on those two issues for this year. You can tell us about some of the, we know that those may connect to your broader organizing strategies. For voter engagement, we want to know that you're doing voter engagement in a way that is building the broader power of your organization. But we will be looking for groups that can clearly articulate the ways that what they're working on relates to climate justice and voter engagement. Second, as we mentioned before, we're going to be looking for groups that have a clear strategy for building power that's grounded in a power analysis that centers base building and the building of strategic alliances. Hashim talked about that before. We think that strong organizing is about building power, and we want to know how you see your organizing building power. Third, we're going to look for groups that have some track record for successfully engaging young people in organizing. Now, we may fund some new and emerging organizations. We know that there's new and emerging organizations that have done some powerful work, although they've only been around for 6 months or a year. So if you're a newer organization, we'll want you to sort of demonstrate what makes, what gives you the capacity in this moment as an emerging organization to be able to have a powerful impact on the young people that you're organizing in the next time period. So we are open to proposals from emerging organizations, but we'll be looking, for folks that really have the capacity to engage in some powerful organizing in this moment. For those projects addressing climate change, again, the focus should really be on how are you lifting up the leadership of young people of color around that issue and in the climate movement. For those folks who are applying around voter engagement, we are not the funder who's going to just be interested in straight, how are you turning out and registering the largest number of voters? We really want to hear how is your voter engagement part of that larger strategy for building power in your community. So standalone efforts that are just about turning out the vote, that's not our jam, right? We're interested in how you're using organizing as part of this broader strategy, voter engagement to really build power. And last, we'll say that we may give preference to organizations in areas that have less philanthropic resource. So a little bit about what we will not fund. One, again, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, as many of you are, and that means that we cannot support through this grant lobbying, support for legislation, or support for candidates of any kind. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can do advocacy as a nonprofit, and if you have more questions about how that works, in the RFP, there's a link to the Boulder Advocacy and the Alliance for Justice and some of the tools that they have. There's a lot of powerful advocacy that you can do as a nonprofit that is not lobbying, but we cannot support with this grant any specific lobbying efforts. We can try to answer questions that you have about that. You can also contact our colleagues at the Alliance for Justice and look at some of the resources that we put in the RFP to have a better understanding of what that means. Similarly, voter engagement activities not only have to be fully nonpartisan, but again, they have to be part of a broader strategy, not a standalone effort. We have there are some specific laws and rules that apply to voter registration, and I'll say more about this in a moment. But for now, I'll just say that voter registration cannot be a standalone activity. It's something that you might engage in as one of other activities for voter engagement. We cannot dedicate funds specifically for voter registration. I'll say more about that in a moment. Again, organizations that are part of FCYO's Pipelines to Power initiative are not eligible for this. We want to make sure that we spread the wealth a little bit. And because of our limited focus, we're not going to be funding organizing that's primarily on four-year college campuses. We're going to be primarily focused on community-based organizing that's specifically with working class young people and young people of color. So a little bit more about voter registration and get out the vote. Again, voter engagement activities have to be fully nonpartisan. They can't express advocacy towards a party or candidate. It's okay to support increased engagement of a specific underrepresented constituency or geographic area. So supporting further engagement of young people of color, of people in a specific community that you're based in, that's fine. But there can't be any bias or advocacy based on party affiliation or a candidate. You may use issues in your voter engagement work, but they should be stated in a way that doesn't prefer one party or candidate. And again, if you need further help understanding any of the rules around nonpartisan voter engagement, there's a lot that you can do as a nonprofit and some things that you shouldn't do. And we put links in the RFP to, again, some of the resources from Boulder Advocacy at the Alliance for Justice to help you have a better understanding of what you can and can't do as a nonprofit around voter engagement. I mentioned before, there are some specific restrictions that we have because of our funding source around voter registration in particular. So we are not allowed to dedicate funds specifically for voter registration. As a nonprofit organization, you are allowed to conduct voter registration as part of a broader range of activities. But we cannot fund proposals that list voter registration as a dedicated activity. So we can consider proposals where voter registration is one of several activities in which you might engage, or a possible activity in addition to others. So if you're telling us about voter registration in particular, right? Again, your organization is allowed to engage in voter registration. We just can't dedicate or earmark funds to that. So it's better for you to tell us about voter registration as one of several activities that you might engage in than to specifically dedicate it as a source of funds for this. Right? Again, there's more resources on that from the Alliance for Justice, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have around that. Our anticipated timeline. So we are going to, we released the RFP on February 13th. We're having this informational webinar today, February 20th. The proposals are going to be due on March 13th, and we hope to get grant decisions out to everybody by April 17th. I'll say one other thing about the way that we're going to make these grants. You know, we're asking for some information about the work that you're doing around climate justice and around climate justice and voter engagement, but we will make these grants as general operating support grants to your organization. That's easier for us and easier for your organizations as well. But please do tell us in your proposal about some of the work that you're doing in relation to those issues. Let's see. So next, let me go into a little bit about the RFP process. We have a two-stage RFP process, and we have a new process this year that we're because we've developed a new system that hopefully will be easier for us and easy for you. So the first step in our process is to either complete or update your profile on the FCYO Youth Organizing Landscape Map. So many of your organizations may already have a profile on there. If you do, just make sure it's up to date. We will use that map profile as part of the scoring process. So it's important that you have a fully complete profile and that it's up to date with information about your organization. So there's a link there, you can set up that. And then in addition to that, we ask you to set up an online application using the new portal that FCYO has developed as part of the through the SurveyMonkey Apply. And hopefully we have a pretty streamlined application process. So I'm going to switch for a second now, and I'm going to show you that site. Give me 1 second to bring that up. And show you what that site looks like. All right, so this is our new this is our new site for online applications. So this is the first site that you'll go to. Then you'll see the Moment to Movement Fund. You'll click more there. Right. The full RFP is listed here. You will go into check eligibility. There's a short eligibility quiz. Right. And as long as you are engaging young people of color, gender oppressed young people 13 to 25 in organizing, engage young people in the leadership of the organization, and you have a C3, or it will give you an option to tell us that you have a fiscal agent. It'll tell you that you're eligible. Then you'll click apply. Now, these are the steps for the online application. We've tried to make this pretty simple and straightforward. The first part just asks for some basic organizational information, contact information for the executive director, all of that. And it does ask for a 1-paragraph summary of your proposal. Then is the narrative section. We have 4 questions. What do you hope to achieve through this work? Through the work for which you are applying, and how does it relate to climate justice and voter engagement? This is a chance to give us a basic overview of what you hope to accomplish in this next time period. We see these as 1-year grants. So what do you hope to accomplish over the next year? And how does that relate to climate justice and voter engagement? You have 500 words maximum. So that's about 3-4 paragraphs, something like that, to give us a basic overview of what you hope to accomplish. The second question is, again, what actions might you take to reach your goals? 500 words there. We have a smaller 250 words to briefly tell us about the constituency, you know, who's involved in this work, age, race, gender, how many young people are involved. That's just 250 words. We just want to make sure that we have a sense of who's involved in this work. And then lastly is this question about how do you see this work building power for your community? And again, referring to what Hashim talked about earlier about our strategy for building power. We want to hear your take on how this campaign will really build long-term power for your organization. So that's it. That's the narrative. Just 4 questions, relatively short answers. The other parts of this online application, let's see. So there's the, let's see. So there's the organizational information. There's the narrative. There's a reminder here to make sure that you do complete the landscape map on FCYO's site. So once you've done that, you can just click the green button. So that's just to remind you to make sure you do that as well. So that will be part of the scoring process. There's a place here where you enter in the tax ID or EIN of your 501c3 or your fiscal agent's 501c3. And then there's just a couple of attachments to upload. The 501c3 letter that's yours or your fiscal agent's, a recently signed W-9, a current organizational budget, and the most recent audited financial statements. And each of those can just be uploaded right here, and there's some guidance about how to name the document. And that's it. So it's it's really some basic organizational information, 4 questions in the narrative, and a couple of attachments. So we've tried to make this as streamlined and simple a process as we can. I think that's the overview of the online system, and hopefully that will make the applying easy for you all and easy for us in the review process. So with that, I will stop. I will turn off the sharing, and again, happy to take address some of your questions. So if you have more questions that we haven't gotten to in the chat yet, please feel free to drop your questions in, and we'll try to address some right now. Let's see. Someone said, can you advise what budget size would be considered less philanthropic resources? I think that referred to, we said something in the RFP that we may have a preference for regions of the country. So in particular, I think we may have a preference for organizations in the South, in the Midwest, in rural areas, right? We will try to have some geographic diversity of the cohort. And make sure that we have representation of some of the places where there tends to be less philanthropy. We don't have a specific definition or budget size of that, but we will just be aware of having some kind of broader geographic diversity on that. Let's see, other questions we have here. Let's see, what if an organization hasn't had an audit yet? If you haven't had your audit yet, just let us know that. If your organization is new or it's small enough that you haven't had one, that's fine. What I would do in that case is just submit a letter in the place of the audit explaining why you don't have one yet. If your organization is not required to have an audit or is new, that's fine, just let us know. But for organizations that do have one, we are required to have them on file. Other questions here. Let's see. So if you're fiscally sponsored, do we submit audit of our fiscal sponsor? Yes. I assume most projects aren't audited themselves. So if you're fiscally sponsored, it is the audit of the fiscal sponsor that you would submit. Let's see, there's a question here. I might need some more context. So April 20 to April 21, do you have any suggestions, interest in engagement plans post-election day? The grant period, we'll get the grants out. We'll make announcements around April 17th is our intention. It'll probably take us 2 to 3 weeks from there to, get all the paperwork signed and get a grant to you. So we'll probably be talking about a grant period that is that would be likely like May 1st, from May 1st, 2020 to May 1st, 2021. And again, we don't have any specific requirements, interest in, the voter engagement activities that we're interested in supporting are, bigger than just any one particular election. We're interested in the ways that your organization is using elections as an opportunity to build the base of your organization and to build broader power. So we don't have any particular requirements about how you're engaging in any particular election. Question here, when discussing youth-led, does this mean having youth in paid positions or staff, or can we apply to different ways in which youth lead projects? You definitely can talk about different ways in which young people are involved in the leadership. We know that different organizations do youth leadership in different ways. There's not one way, there's not one model for what youth leadership looks like in an organization. We want to see that there is really meaningful youth leadership in your organization. And in the question around your constituency, you can tell us a little bit about that if you want. But we don't require one particular model for what youth leadership looks like. Question here, should applications focus on either voter engagement or climate change work, or can they include both? You can absolutely include both. It's your work. Tell us they should include at least one of those. For this effort, we are going to be focused on efforts that are about either, that include at least climate change or voter engagement, but it's totally fine if they do both, and we'd love to hear about work that's at the intersection of those two things. The question here is, we're working to empower immigrant families, many with undocumented members who cannot vote. Thoughts on non-citizen voting rights activities? That's a great question. I will admit that I am not an expert on that, but I do know that there are many organizations that organize undocumented folks. Undocumented folks cannot vote, but they can participate in voter engagement activities. So I know organizations, many organizations that have a constituency that's led by undocumented folks that have built a strategy around building electoral power, even though some of their core members can't vote themselves. And in fact, much of what we're talking about is organizing young people around voting, many of whom are under 18 and can't vote themselves, but are sometimes some of the most powerful messengers around organizing their communities to get out and vote. We absolutely think that there's lots of ways to engage folks who may not be able to vote themselves in voter engagement activities. And there's a lot of organizations out there in the immigrant organizing world that I think have a lot of expertise on how to do that. Any last questions that people want to ask us now? Again, if you have additional questions, you can send them to the grants@fcyo.org, and we'll attempt to answer specific questions that way. Please, keep in mind that we currently have funds to make about 17 grants. I don't know how many proposals we get. It will probably be over 100. That means that unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of good work that we are not going to be able to fund. We will try to support as much of it as we can. We do then sometimes share some of those proposals with some of the funders in our network to see if we can get resources to other groups. But keep in mind that, FCYO, we're trying to raise as much money as we can and get as much money to your groups. And just because we aren't able to support you all this time doesn't mean that we aren't interested in knowing about your work and don't really support it. Sometimes we just get more good proposals than we're able to fund. So please, stay in touch with us, stay part of our network, even if we aren't able to support you all this time. few other questions that came in that we'll address before jumping off. It says, if the campaign we are planning is not underway, set to take off in March, are we eligible to apply? Yes, that's fine. March is before we would start. It should be work that you're going to be doing over the next year during the grant period. We will, I think, want to see some, what's your organization's capacity? Is it a brand new organization, right? If it's a new organization or emerging, what gives you, what gives you the confidence that you're going to be able to take on this work, this new work really successfully? What's your track record for being able to do that? Let's see. My question is, since the organizations that I'm part of is fully run by BIPOC, young people from high school and university who focus more on community-based work than a 4-year period, do we need an adult to apply? You don't need an adult to apply, but we as a 501c3 organization, we can only give money to nonprofit organizations. So you do need a fiscal agent. In order for us to make a grant to an organization, they have to demonstrate that they have a 501c3. If you need help figuring that out, if you don't have that currently, you can reach out to us and we can talk and try to see if there's a way that we can help connect you with somebody. We know that there's lots of really good organizing that happens outside of that. Okay, you have a fiscal agent, you're good, that's fine, right? Yep. Let's see. It says, would a campaign focused on advocating for the lowering of the voting age to 16 in municipal elections not be considered? No, that would be considered. We're definitely interested. There's some great work that's happening around the country around voting age work, and I think we would be happy to consider that work. That's a lowering the voting age to 16 is a great strategy. What we would want you to tell us is, how do you see lowering the voting age to 16 as part of a strategy to build long-term power for your community? I imagine I can imagine a lot of ways where having more of your constituents be able to vote would build the power of your community. But so we'd ask you to tell us about how that would happen. But lowering the voting age is certainly an exciting piece of work that's happening across the country. So how did FCYO identify climate justice and voter engagement as the 2 priorities for funding at this time? That's a great question. I think, we went through a conversation, FCYO is an organization that has both funders and youth organizers on our board. We've been in a pretty deep process of consulting with a lot of organizers from across the country about what are the key issues in this time period. Part of our recognition was that we have a limited pool of funds for this fund, and we'd only be able to make a small number of grants, and it's a waste of time for a lot of organizations to keep it entirely. We end up, when we make it totally open-ended, we get hundreds and hundreds of proposals, most of which we have to turn down, which is not a good use of the time of those folks' time. So we wanted to narrow down a little bit, but we really felt like climate justice and voter engagement are particularly powerful and critical issues in this moment. As we said, we think that the leadership, that climate justice is such an essential issue right now, and that the leadership of young people of color in that movement is so important. And we know that we support lots of organizations led by young people of color. We think there's a contribution that those groups can make and that we can make to supporting their efforts. So I think we just thought that those were 2 really timely issues and key issues for really building power in this moment. And so we decided to focus our efforts on those key issues. We generally support more, open-ended, less issue-specific work. And as we raise more money, we want to create opportunities to do that. But given a limited pool of funds, we decided to be targeted and focus it there for now. says, can you speak a little bit about the line between issue-based programming that helps young people with voter education and understanding candidate platforms versus what's not eligible partisan efforts? I can say a little bit about this, but I would encourage folks in the RFP, there's a phone number and a website for our colleagues at the Alliance for Justice. They're really the experts on that work. So I would encourage you to reach out to them, and some of the resources that we linked have examples of what is permissible and what's not. What I'll say is that, any voter engagement that you do has to be fully nonpartisan, has to be neutral. And if you're connecting it to issue-based organizing, the issues are supposed to be presented in ways that don't prefer one candidate or party or another. Question here is, what if we have a C4 and are currently in the works to create a C3? The issue is that it takes us a while for the C3 to be created. So we are a C3. We can only grant to C3 organizations. So if you don't currently have a C3, you will need to have a C3 fiscal sponsor that can receive the C3 funds. I'm pretty sure that's correct. I will follow up on that and make sure that's accurate, and you can follow up with us by email. All right, I think we've addressed the questions that have come in so far. Again, if you have additional questions, please send them to us at grants@fcyo.org. Again, we know there's so much important work that y'all are doing. We hope to support as much of it as we can. We at FCYO are always amazed by the powerful work that y'all are doing across the country. We're always trying to figure out how to bring in more funders to supporting this work. So we hope that we'll be able to support your work in this time period. And if you're not, please stay in touch with us. Let us know about what you're doing, and we hope to be able to advocate for it in the long run. We feel honored to be able to connect to the powerful work that you're doing. So thank you all for attending and for joining us on this webinar. Again, if you have additional questions, please email us at grants@fcyo.org. And we look forward to being in touch, and we look forward to learning about so much of the important and powerful work that you're doing and supporting as much of it as we can. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care.